The male population of the class rushed as one to her assistance. "Lord," I thought, "she's scared of a mouse." Little Chuck Little, whose patience with all living things was phenomenal, said, "Which way did he go, Miss Caroline? Tell us where he went, quick! D.C.!" He turned to a boy behind him. "D.C., shut the door, and we'll catch him. Quick, ma'am, where'd he go?" Miss Caroline pointed a shaking finger not at the floor, nor at a desk, but to a hulking individual unknown to me. Little Chuck's face contracted, and he said gently, "You mean him, ma'am?" "Yes'm, he's alive." "Did he scare you some way?" Miss Caroline said desperately, "I was just walking by when it crawled out of his hair. Just crawled out of his hair." Little Chuck grinned broadly. "There ain't no need to fear a cootie, ma'am. Ain't you ever seen one? Now don't you be afraid. You just go back to your desk and teach us some more." Little Chuck Little was another member of the population who didn't know where his next meal was coming from, but he was a born gentleman. He put his hand under her elbow and led Miss Caroline to the front of the room. "Now don't you fret, ma'am," he said. "There ain't no need to fear a cootie. I'll just fetch you some cool water." The cootie's host showed not the faintest interest in the furor he had wrought. He searched the scalp above his forehead, located his guest, and pinched it between his thumb and forefinger. Miss Caroline watched the process in horrid fascination. Little Chuck brought water in a paper cup, and she drank it gratefully. Finally she found her voice. "What is your name, son?" she asked softly. The boy blinked. "Who? Me?" Miss Caroline nodded. "Boris Yule." Miss Caroline inspected her roll book. "I have a Yule here, but I don't have a first name. Would you spell your first name for me?" "Don't know how. They call me Burris, Tom." "Well, Burris," said Miss Caroline, "I think we'd better excuse you for the rest of the afternoon. I want you to go home and wash your hair." From her desk she produced a thick volume, leafed through its pages, and read for a moment. "A good home remedy for—" "Burris, I want you to go home and wash your hair with lye soap. When you've done that, treat your scalp with kerosene." "What for, missus?" "To get rid of the, cooties. You see, Burris, the other children might catch them, and you wouldn't want that, would you?" The boy stood up. He was the filthiest human I had ever seen. His neck was dark gray, the back of his hands were rusty, and his fingernails were black deep into the quick. He peered at Miss Caroline from a fist-sized clean space on his face. No one had noticed him, probably, because Miss Caroline and I had entertained the class most of the morning. "And, Burris," said Miss Caroline, "please bathe yourself before you come back tomorrow." The boy laughed rudely. "You ain't sending me home, missus. I was on the verge of leaving. I done my time for this year." Miss Caroline looked puzzled. "What do you mean by that?" The boy did not answer. He gave a short, contemptuous snort. One of the elderly members of the class answered her. "He's one of the Yules, ma'am." And I wondered if this explanation would be as unsuccessful as my attempt. But Miss Caroline seemed willing to listen. "Whole school's full of 'em. They come first day every year and then leave. The truant lady gets 'em here, 'cause she threatens 'em with the sheriff, but she's give up trying to hold 'em. She reckons she's carried out the law just getting their names on the roll and running 'em here the first day. You're supposed to mark 'em absent the rest of the year." "But what about their parents? asked Miss Caroline in genuine concern. "Ain't got no mother," was the answer, "and their pa's right contentious." Burris Ewell was flattered by the recital. "Been comin' to the first day of the first grade for 3 year now," he said expansively. "Reckon if I'm smart this year, they'll promote me to the second." Miss Caroline said, "Sit back down, please, Burris." And the moment she said it, I knew she had made a serious mistake. The boy's condescension flashed to anger. "You try and make me, missus." Little Chuck Little got to his feet. "Let him go, ma'am," he said. "He's a mean one, a hard-down mean one. He's liable to start something, and there's some little folks here." He was among the most diminutive of men, but when Burris Ewell turned toward him, little Chuck's right hand went to his pocket. "Watch your step, Burris," he said. "I'd soon kill you as look at you. Now go home." Burris seemed to be afraid of a child half his height, and Miss Caroline took advantage of his indecision. "Burris, go home. If you don't, I'll call the principal," she said. "I'll have to report this anyway." The boy snorted and slouched leisurely to the door. Safely out of range, he turned and shouted, "Report and be damned to ye! Ain't no snot-nosed slut of a school-teacher ever born can make me do nothing. You ain't making me go nowhere, missus. You just remember that. You ain't making me go nowhere." He waited until he was sure she was crying. Then he shuffled out of the building. Soon we were clustered around her desk, trying in our various ways to comfort her. "He was a real mean one. Below the belt. You ain't called on to teach folks like that. Them ain't Makeum's ways, Miss Caroline, not really. Now don't you fret, ma'am. Miss Caroline, why don't you read us a story? That cat thing was real fine this morning." Miss Caroline smiled, blew her nose, said, "Thank you, darlings," dispersed us, opened a book, and mystified the first grade with a long narrative about a toad frog that lived in a hall.
This ends Disc 1. To Kill a Mockingbird, Disc 2.
When I passed the Radley place for the 4th time that day, twice at a full gallop, my gloom had deepened to match the house. If the remainder of the school year were as fraught with drama as the first day, perhaps it would be mildly entertaining. But the prospect of spending 9 months refraining from reading and writing made me think of running away. By late afternoon, most of my traveling plans were complete. When Jem and I raced each other up the sidewalk to meet Atticus coming home from work, I didn't give him much of a race. It was our habit to run meet Atticus the moment we saw him round the post-office corner in the distance. Atticus seemed to have forgotten my noontime fall from grace. He was full of questions about school. My replies were monosyllabic, and he did not press me. Perhaps Calpurnia sensed that my day had been a grim one. She let me watch her fix supper. "Shut your eyes and open your mouth, and I'll give you a surprise," she said. It was not often that she made crackling bread. She said she never had time. But with both of us at school, today had been an easy one for her. She knew I loved crackling bread. "I missed you today," she said. "The house got so lonesome long about 2 o'clock, I had to turn on the radio." "Why?" "Jem and me ain't ever in the house, unless it's raining." "I know," she said, "but one of you's always in calling distance. I wonder how much of the day I spend just calling after you." "Well," she said, getting up from the kitchen chair, "it's enough time to make a pan of crackling bread, I reckon. You run along now, and let me get supper on the table." Calpurnia bent down and kissed me. I ran along, wondering what had come over her. She had wanted to make up with me, that was it. She had always been too hard on me. She had at last seen the error of her fractious ways. She was sorry, and too stubborn to say so. I was weary from the day's crimes. After supper, Atticus sat down with the paper and called, "Scout, ready to read?" The Lord sent me more than I could bear, and I went to the front porch. Atticus followed me. "Something wrong, Scout?" I told Atticus I didn't feel very well, and didn't think I'd go to school any more if it was all right with him. Atticus sat down in the swing and crossed his legs. His fingers wandered to his watch pocket. He said that was the only way he could think. He waited in amiable silence, and I sought to reinforce my position. "You never went to school, and you do all right, so I'll just stay home too. You can teach me like Granddaddy taught you and Uncle Jack." "No, I can't," said Atticus. "I have to make a living. Besides, they'd put me in jail if I kept you at home. Dose of magnesia for you tonight and school tomorrow." "I'm feeling all right, really." "Thought so. Now what's the matter?" Bit by bit I told him the day's misfortunes. "And she said you taught me all wrong, so we can't ever read any more, ever. Please don't send me back. Please, sir." Atticus stood up and walked to the end of the porch. When he completed his examination of the wisteria vine, he strolled back to me. "First of all," he said, "if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view." "Sir?" "Until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." Atticus said I had learned many things today, and Miss Caroline had learned several things herself. She had learned not to hand something to a Cunningham, for one thing. But if Walter and I had put ourselves in her shoes, we'd have seen it was an honest mistake on her part. We could not expect her to learn all Macomb's ways in one day, and we could not hold her responsible when she knew no better. "I'll be dogged," I said. "I didn't know no better than not to read to her, and she held me responsible. Listen, Atticus, I don't have to go to school." I was bursting with a sudden thought. "Burris Ewell, remember? He just goes to school the first day. The truant lady reckons she's carried out the law when she gets his name on the roll." "You can't do that, Scout," Atticus said. "Sometimes it's better to bend the law a little in special cases. In your case, the law remains rigid. So to school you must go. I don't see why I have to when he doesn't." "Then listen." Atticus said the Ewells had been the disgrace of Macomb for 3 generations. None of them had done an honest day's work in his recollection. He said that some Christmas, when he was getting rid of the tree, he would take me with him and show me where and how they lived. They were people, but they lived like animals. "They can go to school any time they want to, when they show the faintest symptom of wanting an education," said Atticus. "There are ways of keeping them in school by force, but it's silly to force people like the Ewells into a new environment. If I didn't go to school tomorrow, you'd force me to." "Let us leave it at this," said Atticus dryly. "You, Miss Scout Finch, are of the common folk. You must obey the law." He said that the Ewells were members of an exclusive society made up of Ewells. In certain circumstances, the common folk judiciously allowed them certain privileges, by the simple method of becoming blind to some of the Ewells' activities. They didn't have to go to school, for one thing. Another thing, Mr. Bob Ewell, Burris's father, was permitted to hunt and trap out of season. "Atticus, that's bad," I said. In Macomb County, hunting out of season was a misdemeanor at law. a capital felony in the eyes of the populace. "It's against the law, all right," said my father, "and it's certainly bad. But when a man spends his relief checks on green whiskey, his children have a way of crying from hunger pains. I don't know of any landowner around here who begrudges those children any game their father can hit." "Mr. Ewell shouldn't do that." "Of course he shouldn't, but he'll never change his ways. Are you going to take out your disapproval on his children?" "No, sir," I murmured, and made a final stand. "But if I keep on going to school, we can't ever read any more." "That's really bothering you, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." When Atticus looked down at me, I saw the expression on his face that always made me expect something. "Do you know what a compromise is?" he asked. "Bending the law?" "No, an agreement reached by mutual concessions. It works this way," he said. "If you'll concede the necessity of going to school, we'll go on reading every night, just as we always have. Is it a bargain?" "Yes, sir." "We'll consider it sealed without the usual formality," Atticus said when he saw me preparing to spit. As I opened the front screen door, Atticus said, "By the way, Scout, you'd better not say anything at school about our agreement." "Why not?" "I'm afraid our activities would be received with considerable disapprobation by the more learned authorities." Jem and I were accustomed to our father's last will and testament diction, and we were at all times free to interrupt Atticus for a translation when it was beyond our understanding. "Huh, sir?" "I never went to school," he said, "but I have a feeling that if you tell Miss Caroline we read every night, she'll get after me. And I wouldn't want her after me." Atticus kept us in fits that evening, gravely reading columns of print about a man who sat on a flagpole for no discernible reason, which was reason enough for Jem to spend the following Saturday aloft in the treehouse. Jem sat from after breakfast until sunset, and would have remained overnight had not Atticus severed his supply lines. I had spent most of the day climbing up and down, running errands for him, providing him with literature, nourishment, and water, and was carrying him blankets for the night, when Atticus said if I paid no attention to him, Jem would come down. Atticus was right. Chapter 4. The remainder of my school days were no more auspicious than the first. Indeed, they were an endless project that slowly evolved into a unit, in which miles of construction paper and wax crayon were expended by the state of Alabama in its well-meaning but fruitless efforts to teach me group dynamics. What Jem called the Dewey Decimal System was school-wide by the end of my first year, so I had no chance to compare it with other teaching techniques. I could only look around me. Atticus and my uncle, who went to school at home, knew everything. At least what one didn't know the other did. Furthermore, I couldn't help noticing that my father had served for years in the state legislature, elected each time without opposition, innocent of the adjustments my teachers thought essential to the development of good citizenship. Jem, educated on a half-decimal, half-dunce-cap basis, seemed to function effectively alone or in a group. But Jem was a poor example. No tutorial system devised by man could have stopped him from getting at books. As for me, I knew nothing except what I gathered from Time magazine and reading everything I could lay hands on at home. But as I inched sluggishly along the treadmill of the Macomb County school system, I could not help receiving the impression that I was being cheated out of something. Out of what, I knew not, Yet I did not believe that 12 years of unrelieved boredom was exactly what the state had in mind for me. As the year passed, released from school 30 minutes before Jem, who had to stay until 3 o'clock, I ran by the Radley place as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the safety of our front porch. One afternoon, as I raced by, something caught my eye, and caught it in such a way that I took a deep breath, a long look around, and went back. 2 live oaks stood at the edge of the Radley lot. Their roots reached out into the side road and made it bumpy. Something about one of the trees attracted my attention. Some tinfoil was sticking in a knothole just above my eye level, winking at me in the afternoon sun. I stood on tiptoe, hastily looked around once more, reached into the hole, and withdrew 2 pieces of chewing gum, minus their outer wrappers. My first impulse was to get it into my mouth as quickly as possible, but I remembered where I was. I ran home, and on our front porch I examined my loot. The gum looked fresh. I sniffed it, and it smelled all right. I licked it and waited for a while. When I did not die, I crammed it into my mouth. Wrigley's Double Mint. When Jem came home, he asked me where I got such a wad. I told him I found it. "Don't eat things you find, Scout. This wasn't on the ground. It was in a tree." Jem growled. "Well, it was," I said. "It was sticking in that tree yonder, the one coming from school. Spit it out right now." I spat it out. The tang was fading anyway. "I've been chewing it all afternoon, and I ain't dead yet, not even sick." Jem stamped his foot. "Don't you know you're not supposed to even touch the trees over there? You'll get killed if you do. You touched the house once. That was different. You go gargle, right now, you hear me?" "Ain't neither. It'll take the taste out of my mouth." "You don't, and I'll tell Calpurnia on you." Rather than risk a tangle with Calpurnia, I did as Jem told me. For some reason, my first year of school had wrought a great change in our relationship. Calpurnia's tyranny, unfairness, and meddling in my business had faded to gentle grumblings of general disapproval. On my part, I went to much trouble sometimes, not to provoke her. Summer was on the way. Jem and I awaited it with impatience. Summer was our best season. It was sleeping on the back screened porch in cots, or trying to sleep in the treehouse. Summer was everything good to eat. It was 1,000 colors in a parched landscape. But most of all, summer was dill. The authorities released us early the last day of school, and Jem and I walked home together. "Reckon old Dill'll be coming home tomorrow," I said. "Probably day after," said Jem. "Mississippi turns 'em loose a day later." As we came to the live oaks at the Radley place, I raised my finger to point for the 100th time to the knothole where I had found the chewing gum, trying to make Jem believe I had found it there, and found myself pointing at another piece of tinfoil. "I see it, Scout! I see it!" Jem looked around, reached up, and gingerly pocketed a tiny, shiny package. We ran home, and on the front porch we looked at a small box patchworked with bits of tinfoil collected from chewing gum wrappers. It was the kind of box wedding rings came in, purple velvet with a minute catch. Jem flicked open the tiny catch. Inside were 2 scrubbed and polished pennies, one on top of the other. Jem examined them. "Indian heads," he said. 1906, and Scout, one of 'em's 1900. These are real old." 1900, I echoed. "Say, Hush a minute. I'm thinking. Jim, you reckon that's somebody's hiding place? No, don't anybody much but us pass by there, unless it's some grown person's. Grown folks don't have hiding places. You reckon we ought to keep 'em, Jim? I don't know what we could do, Scout. Who'd we give 'em back to? I know for a fact don't anybody go by there. Cecil goes by the back street, and all the way around by town to get home. Cecil Jacobs, who lived at the far end of our street next door to the post office, walked a total of 1 mile per school day to avoid the Radley place and old Mrs. Henry Lafayette DuBose. Mrs. DuBose lived 2 doors up the street from us. Neighborhood opinion was unanimous that Mrs. DuBose was the meanest old woman who ever lived. Jem wouldn't go by her place without Atticus beside him. What you reckon we ought to do, Jem? Finders were keepers, unless title was proven. Plucking an occasional camellia, getting a squirt of hot milk from Miss Maudie Atkinson's cow on a summer day, helping ourselves to someone's scuppernongs was part of our ethical culture, but money was different. Tell you what, said Jem, we'll keep 'em till school starts, then go around and ask everybody if they're theirs. They're some bus child's, maybe. He was too taken up with getting out of school today and forgot 'em. These are somebody's, I know that. See how they've been slicked up? They've been saved. Yeah, but why should somebody want to put away chewing gum like that? You know it doesn't last. I don't know, Scout, but these are important to somebody. How's that, Jem? Well, Indian heads. Well, they come from the Indians. They're real strong magic. They make you have good luck. Not like fried chicken when you're not looking for it, but things like long life and good health and passing 6 weeks' tests. These are real valuable to somebody. I'm going to put 'em in my trunk. Before Jem went to his room, he looked for a long time at the Radley place. He seemed to be thinking again. 2 days later, Dill arrived in a blaze of glory. He had ridden the train by himself from Meridian to Macomb Junction, a courtesy title. Macomb Junction was in Abbott County, where he had been met by Miss Rachel in Macomb's one taxi. He had eaten dinner in the diner. He had seen 2 twins hitched together get off the train in Bay St. Louis, and stuck to his story regardless of threats. He had discarded the abominable blue shorts that were buttoned to his shirts, and wore real short pants with a belt. He was somewhat heavier, no taller, and said he had seen his father. Dill's father was taller than ours. He had a black beard, pointed, and was president of the L&N Railroad. "I helped the engineer for a while," said Dill, yawning. "In a pig's ear you did, Dill." "Hush," said Jem. "What'll we play today?" "Tom and Sam and Dick," said Dill. "Let's go in the front yard." Dill wanted the Rover boys because there were 3 respectable parts. He was clearly tired of being our character man. "I'm tired of those," I said. I was tired of playing Tom Rover, who suddenly lost his memory in the middle of a picture show and was out of the script until the end, when he was found in Alaska. "Make us up one, Jem," I said. "I'm tired of making 'em up." Our first days of freedom, and we were tired. I wondered what the summer would bring. We had strolled to the front yard, where Dill stood looking down the street at the dreary face of the Radley place. "I smell death," he said. "I do, I mean it," he said when I told him to shut up. "You mean when somebody's dying, you can smell it?" "No, I mean I can smell somebody, and tell if they're gonna die. An old lady taught me how. Dill leaned over and sniffed me. Jean, Louise, Finch, you are going to die in 3 days. Dill, if you don't hush, I'll knock you bow-legged. I mean it now. Y'all hush, growled Jem. You act like you believe in hot steams. You act like you don't, I said. What's a hot steam? Asked Dill. Haven't you ever walked along a lonesome road at night and passed by a hot place? Jem asked Dill. A hot steam's somebody who can't get to heaven, just wallows around on lonesome roads, and if you walk through him, when you die you'll be one too, and you'll go around at night sucking people's breath. How can you keep from passing through one? You can't, said Jem. Sometimes they stretch all the way across the road, but if you have to go through one, you say, Angel bright, life in death, get off the road, don't suck my breath. That keeps them from wrapping around you. Don't you believe a word he says, Dill, I said. Calpurnia says that's nigger talk. Jem scowled darkly at me, but said, Well, are we going to play anything or not? Let's roll in the tire, I suggested. Jem sighed. You know I'm too big. You can push. I ran to the backyard and pulled an old car tire from under the house. I slapped it up to the front yard. I'm first, I said. Dill said he ought to be first. He just got here. Jem arbitrated, awarded me first push with an extra time for Dill, and I folded myself inside the tire. Until it happened, I did not realize that Jem was offended by my contradicting him on hot steams, and that he was patiently awaiting an opportunity to reward me. He did, by pushing the tire down the sidewalk with all the force in his body. Ground, sky, and houses melted into a mad pallet. My ears throbbed. I was suffocating. I could not put out my hands to stop. They were wedged between my chest and knees. I could only hope that Jem would outrun the tire and me, or that I would be stopped by a bump in the sidewalk. I heard him behind me, chasing and shouting. The tire bumped on gravel, skeeted across the road, crashed into a barrier, and popped me like a cork onto pavement. Dizzy and nauseated, I lay on the cement and shook my head still, pounded my ears to silence, and heard Jem's voice, Scout! Get away from there! Come on! I raised my head and stared at the Radley Place steps in front of me. I froze. Come on, Scout! Don't just lie there! Jem was screaming. Get up, can't you? I got to my feet, trembling as I thawed. Get the tire! Jem hollered. Bring it with you! Ain't you got any sense at all? When I was able to navigate, I ran back to them as fast as my shaking knees would carry me. Why didn't you bring it? Jem yelled. Why don't you get it? I screamed. Jem was silent. Go on. It ain't far inside the gate. Why, you even touched the house once, remember? Jem looked at me furiously, could not decline, ran down the sidewalk, treaded water at the gate, then dashed in and retrieved the tire. See there? Jem was scowling triumphantly. Nothing to it. I swear, Scout, sometimes you act so much like a girl, it's mortifying. There was more to it than he knew, but I decided not to tell him. Calpurnia appeared in the front door and yelled, Lemonade time! You all get in out of that hot sun, for you fry alive. Lemonade in the middle of the morning was a summertime ritual. Calpurnia set a pitcher and 3 glasses on the porch, then went about her business. Being out of Jem's good graces did not worry me especially. Lemonade would restore his good humor. Jem gulped down his second glassful and slapped his chest. "I know what we are going to play," he announced. "Something new. Something different." "What?" asked Dill. "Boo Radley." Jem's head at times was transparent. He had thought that up to make me understand he wasn't afraid of Radleys in any shape or form, to contrast his own fearless heroism with my cowardice. "Boo Radley? How?" asked Dill. Jem said, "Scout, you can be Mrs. Radley. I declare if I will. I don't think—" "'Smatter," said Dill. "Still scared?" "He can get out at night when we're all asleep," I said. Jem hissed, "Scout, how's he gonna know what we're doing? Besides, I don't think he's still there. He died years ago, and they stuffed him up the chimney." Dill said, "Jem, you and me can play, and Scout can watch if she's scared." I was fairly sure Boo Radley was inside that house, but I couldn't prove it, and felt it best to keep my mouth shut, or I would be accused of believing in hot steams, phenomena I was immune to in the daytime. Jem parcelled out our roles. I was Mrs. Radley, and all I had to do was come out and sweep the porch. Dill was old Mr. Radley. He walked up and down the sidewalk and coughed when Jem spoke to him. Jem, naturally, was Boo. He went under the front steps and shrieked and howled from time to time. As the summer progressed, so did our game. We polished and perfected it, added dialogue and plot, until we had manufactured a small play upon which we rang changes every day. Dill was a villain's villain. He could get into any character part assigned him, and appear tall if height was part of the devilry required. He was as good as his worst performance. His worst performance was Gothic. I reluctantly played assorted ladies who entered the script. I never thought it as much fun as Tarzan, and I played that summer with more than vague anxiety, despite Jem's assurances that Boo Radley was dead, and nothing would get me, with him and Calpurnia there in the daytime, and Atticus home at night. Jem was a born hero. It was a melancholy little drama, woven from bits and scraps of gossip and neighborhood legend. Mrs. Radley had been beautiful until she married Mr. Radley and lost all her money. She also lost most of her teeth, her hair, and her right forefinger. Dill's contribution. Boo bit it off one night when he couldn't find any cats and squirrels to eat. She sat in the living room and cried most of the time, while Boo slowly whittled away all the furniture in the house. The three of us were the boys who got into trouble. I was the probate judge for a change. Dill led Jem away and crammed him beneath the steps, poking him with the brush-broom. Jem would reappear as needed in the shapes of the sheriff, assorted townsfolk, and Miss Stephanie Crawford, who had more to say about the Radleys than anybody in Maycomb. When it was time to play Boo's big scene, Jem would sneak into the house, steal the scissors from the sewing-machine drawer when Calpurnia's back was turned, then sit in the swing and cut up newspapers. Dill would walk by, cough at Jem, and Jem would fake a plunge into Dill's thigh. From where I stood it looked real. When Mr. Nathan Radley passed us on his daily trip to town, we would stand still and silent until he was out of sight, then wonder what he would do to us if he suspected. Our activities halted when any of the neighbors appeared, and once I saw Miss Maudie Atkinson staring across the street at us, her hedge-clippers poised in mid-air. One day we were so busily playing Chapter 25, Book 2 of One Man's Family, we did not see Atticus standing on the sidewalk looking at us, slapping a rolled magazine against his knee. The sun said 12 noon, "What are you all playing?" he asked. "Nothing," said Jem. Jem's evasion told me our game was a secret, so I kept quiet. "What are you doing with those scissors, then? Why are you tearing up that newspaper? If it's today's, I'll tan you." "Nothing." "Nothing what?" said Atticus. "Nothing, sir." "Give me those scissors," Atticus said. "They're no things to play with. Does this, by any chance, have anything to do with the Radleys?" "No, sir," said Jem, reddening. "I hope it doesn't," he said shortly, and went inside the house. "Jem!" "Shut up! He's gone in the living room. He can hear us in there." Safely in the yard, Dill asked Jem if we could play any more. "I don't know. Atticus didn't say we couldn't." "Jem," I said, "I think Atticus knows it anyway." "No, he don't. If he did, he'd say he did." I was not so sure, but Jem told me I was being a girl, that girls always imagined things. That's why other people hated them so. And if I started behaving like one, I could just go off and find some to play with. "All right, you just keep it up then," I said. "You'll find out." Atticus's arrival was the second reason I wanted to quit the game. The first reason happened the day I rolled into the Radley front yard. Through all the head shaking, quelling of nausea, and Jem yelling, I had heard another sound, so low I could not have heard it from the sidewalk. Someone inside the house was laughing. Chapter 5. My nagging got the better of Jem, eventually, as I knew it would, and to my relief we slowed down the game for a while. He still maintained, however, that Atticus hadn't said we couldn't, therefore we could, and if Atticus ever said we couldn't, Jem had thought of a way around it. He would simply change the names of the characters, and then we couldn't be accused of playing anything. Dill was in hearty agreement with this plan of action. Dill was becoming something of a trial anyway, following Jem about. He had asked me earlier in the summer to marry him. Then he promptly forgot about it. He staked me out, marked as his property, said I was the only girl he would ever love. Then he neglected me. I beat him up twice, but it did no good. He only grew closer to Jem. They spent days together in the treehouse, plotting and planning, calling me only when they needed a third party. But I kept aloof from their more foolhardy schemes for a while, and on pain of being called a girl, I spent most of the remaining twilights that summer sitting with Miss Maudie Atkinson on her front porch. Jem and I had always enjoyed the free run of Miss Maudie's yard, if we kept out of her azaleas, but our contact with her was not clearly defined. Until Jem and Dill excluded me from their plans, she was only another lady in the neighborhood, but a relatively benign presence. Our tacit treaty with Miss Maudie was that we could play on her lawn, eat her scuppernongs if we didn't jump on the arbor, and explore her vast back lot, terms so generous we seldom spoke to her. So careful were we to preserve the delicate balance of our relationship. But Jem and Dill drove me closer to her with their behavior. Miss Maudie hated her house. Time spent indoors was time wasted. She was a widow, a chameleon lady, who worked in her flower beds in an old straw hat and men's coveralls, but after her 5 o'clock bath she would appear on the porch and reign over the street in magisterial beauty. She loved everything that grew in God's earth, even the weeds, with one exception. If she found a blade of nutgrass in her yard, it was like the Second Battle of the Marne. She swooped down upon it with a tin tub and subjected it to blasts from beneath with a poisonous substance she said was so powerful it'd kill us all if we didn't stand out of the way. "Why can't you just pull it up?" I asked, after witnessing a prolonged campaign against a blade not 3 inches high. "Pull it up, child, pull it up." She picked up the limp sprout and squeezed her thumb up its tiny stalk. Microscopic grains oozed out. "Why, one sprig of nutgrass can ruin a whole yard. Look here. When it comes fall, this dries up, and the wind blows it all over Macomb County." Miss Maudie's face likened such an occurrence unto an Old Testament pestilence. Her speech was crisp for a Macomb County inhabitant. She called us by all our names, and when she grinned, she revealed 2 minute gold prongs clipped to her eye-teeth. When I admired them, and hoped I would have some eventually, she said, "Look here." With a click of her tongue she thrust out her bridge-work, a gesture of cordiality that cemented our friendship. Miss Maudie's benevolence extended to Jem and Dill. Whenever they paused in their pursuits, we reaped the benefits of a talent Miss Maudie had hitherto kept hidden from us. She made the best cakes in the neighborhood. When she was admitted into our confidence, every time she baked, she made a big cake and 3 little ones, and she would call across the street, "Jem Finch, Scout Finch, Charles Baker Harris, come here." Our promptness was always rewarded. In summertime, twilights are long and peaceful. Often as not, Miss Maudie and I would sit silently on her porch, watching the sky go from yellow to pink as the sun went down, watching flights of martins sweep low over the neighborhood and disappear behind the schoolhouse rooftops. "Miss Maudie," I said one evening, "do you think Boo Radley's still alive?" "His name's Arthur, and he's alive," she said. She was rocking slowly in her big oak chair. "Do you smell my mimosa? It's like angel's breath this evening." "Yes'm." "How do you know?" "Know what, child?" "That Mr. Arthur's still alive." What a morbid question. But I suppose it's a morbid subject. I know he's alive, Jean Louise, because I haven't seen him carried out yet. "Maybe he died and they stuffed him up the chimney." "Where did you get such a notion?" "That's what Jem said he thought they did." He gets more like Jack Finch every day. Miss Maudie had known Uncle Jack Finch, Atticus's brother, since they were children. Nearly the same age, they had grown up together at Finch's Landing. Miss Maudie was the daughter of a neighboring landowner, Dr. Frank Buford. Dr. Buford's profession was medicine, and his obsession was anything that grew in the ground, so he stayed poor. Uncle Jack Finch confined his passion for digging to his window boxes in Nashville, and stayed rich. We saw Uncle Jack every Christmas, and every Christmas he yelled across the street for Miss Maudie to come marry him. Miss Maudie would yell back, "Call a little louder, Jack Finch, and they'll hear you at the post office. I haven't heard you yet." Jem and I thought this a strange way to ask for a lady's hand in marriage, but then Uncle Jack was rather strange. He said he was trying to get Miss Maudie's goat, that he had been trying unsuccessfully for 40 years, that he was the last person in the world Miss Maudie would think about marrying, but the first person she thought about teasing, and the best defense to her was spirited offense, all of which we understood clearly. "Arthur Radley just stays in the house, that's all," said Miss Maudie. "Wouldn't you stay in the house if you didn't want to come out?" "Yes'm, but I'd want to come out. Why doesn't he?" Miss Maudie's eyes narrowed. "You know that story as well as I do." I never heard why, though. Nobody ever told me why. Miss Maudie settled her bridge work. You know old Mr. Radley was a foot-washing Baptist. That's what you are, ain't it? My shell's not that hard, child. I'm just a Baptist. Don't you all believe in foot-washing? We do, at home, in the bathtub. But we can't have communion with you all. Apparently deciding that it was easier to define primitive baptistry than closed communion, Miss Maudie said, Foot-washers believe anything that's pleasure is a sin. Did you know some of 'em came out of the woods one Saturday and passed by this place and told me and my flowers were going to hell? Your flowers, too? Yes, ma'am. They'd burn right with me. They thought I spent too much time in God's outdoors and not enough time inside the house reading the Bible. My confidence in pulpit gospel lessened at the vision of Miss Maudie stewing forever in various Protestant hells. True enough, she had an acid tongue in her head, and she did not go about the neighborhood doing good, as did Miss Stephanie Crawford. But while no one with a grain of sense trusted Miss Stephanie, Jem and I had considerable faith in Miss Maudie. She had never told on us, had never played cat and mouse with us. She was not at all interested in our private lives. She was our friend. How so reasonable a creature could live in peril of everlasting torment was incomprehensible. That ain't right, Miss Maudie. You're the best lady I know. Miss Maudie grinned. Thank you, ma'am. Thing is, foot-washers think women are a sin by definition. They take the Bible literally, you know. Is that why Mr. Arthur stays in the house? To keep away from women? I'd no idea. It doesn't make sense to me. Looks like if Mr. Arthur was hankering after heaven, he'd come out on the porch at least. Atticus says God's loving folks like you love yourself. Miss Maudie stopped rocking, and her voice hardened. You are too young to understand it, she said, but sometimes the Bible in the hand of one man is worse than a whiskey bottle in the hand of, your father. I was shocked. Atticus doesn't drink whiskey, I said. He never drunk a drop in his life. No'm, yes he did. He said he drank some one time and didn't like it. Miss Maudie laughed. Wasn't talking about your father, she said. What I meant was, if Atticus Finch drank until he was drunk, he wouldn't be as hard as some men are at their best. There are just some kind of men who are so busy worrying about the next world, they've never learned to live in this one. And you can look down the street and see the results. Do you think they're true? All those things they say about Mr. Arthur? What things? I told her. That is 3/4 colored folks and 1/4 Stephanie Crawford, said Miss Maudie grimly. Stephanie Crawford even told me once she woke up in the middle of the night and found him looking in the window at her. I said, What did you do, Stephanie? Move over in the bed and make room for him? That shut her up a while. I was sure it did. Miss Maudie's voice was enough to shut anybody up. No, child, she said. That is a sad house. I remember Arthur Radley when he was a boy. He always spoke nicely to me, no matter what folks said he did. Spoke as nicely as he knew how. You reckon he's crazy? Miss Maudie shook her head. If he's not, he should be by now. The things that happen to people we never really know. What happens in houses behind closed doors? What secrets? Atticus don't ever do anything to Jem and me in the house that he don't do in the yard, I said, feeling it my duty to defend my parent. "Gracious, child, I was raveling a thread. Wasn't even thinking about your father. But now that I am, I'll say this. Atticus Finch is the same in his house as he is on the public streets. How'd you like some fresh pound cake to take home?" I liked it very much. Next morning, when I awakened, I found Jem and Dill in the backyard deep in conversation. When I joined them, as usual, they said, "Go away." "We'll not. This yard's as much mine as it is yours, Jem Finch. I got just as much right to play in it as you have." Dill and Jem emerged from a brief huddle. "If you stay, you've got to do what we tell you," Dill warned. "Well," I said, "who's so high and mighty all of a sudden?" "If you don't say you'll do what we tell you, we ain't going to tell you anything," Dill continued. "You act like you grew 10 inches in the night." "All right. What is it?" Jem said placidly, "We are going to give a note to Boo Radley." "Just how?" I was trying to fight down the automatic terror rising in me. It was all right for Miss Maudie to talk. She was old and snug on her porch. It was different for us. Jem was merely going to put the note on the end of a fishing pole and stick it through the shutters. If anyone came along, Dill would ring the bell. Dill raised his right hand. In it was my mother's silver dinner bell. "I'm going around to the side of the house," said Jem. "We looked yesterday from across the street, and there's a shutter loose. Think maybe I can make it stick on the window-sill at least." "Jem, now you're in it, and you can't get out of it. You'll just stay in it, Miss Priss." Okay, but I don't want to watch." "Jem, somebody was—" "Yes, you will. You'll watch the back end of the lot, and Dill's going to watch the front of the house and up the street. And if anybody comes, he'll ring the bell. That clear?" "All right, then. What'd you write him?" Dill said, "We're asking him real politely to come out sometimes and tell us what he does in there. We said we wouldn't hurt him, and we'd buy him an ice cream." "You all have gone crazy. He'll kill us." Dill said, "It's my idea. I figure if he'd come out and sit a spell with us, he might feel better." "How do you know he don't feel good?" "Well, how'd you feel if you'd been shut up for 100 years with nothing but cats to eat? I bet he's got a beard down to here. Like your daddy's? He ain't got a beard, he—" Dill stopped, as if trying to remember. "Uh-huh, caught you," I said. "You said 'fore you were off the train good, your daddy had a black beard. If it's all the same to you, he shaved it off last summer." "Yeah, and I've got the letter to prove it. He sent me $2, too. Keep on. I reckon he even sent you a mounted police uniform. That never showed up, did it? You just keep on telling 'em, son." Dill Harris could tell the biggest ones I ever heard. Among other things, he had been up in a mail plane 17 times. He had been to Nova Scotia. He had seen an elephant. And his granddaddy was Brigadier General Joe Wheeler, and left him his sword. "You all hush," said Jem. He scuttled beneath the house and came out with a yellow bamboo pole. "Reckon this is long enough to reach from the sidewalk?" "Anybody who's brave enough to go up and touch the house hadn't ought to use a fishing pole," I said. "Why don't you just knock the front door down?" "This is different," said Jem. "How many times do I have to tell you that?" Dill took a piece of paper from his pocket and gave it to Jem. The 3 of us walked cautiously toward the old house. Dill remained at the light pole on the front corner of the lot, and Jem and I edged down the sidewalk parallel to the side of the house. I walked beyond Jem and stood where I could see around the curve. "All clear," I said. "Not a soul in sight." Jem looked up the sidewalk to Dill, who nodded. Jem attached the note to the end of the fishing pole, let the pole out across the yard, and pushed it toward the window he had selected. The pole lacked several inches of being long enough, and Jem leaned over as far as he could. I watched him making jabbing motions for so long, I abandoned my post and went to him. "Can't get it off the pole," he muttered. "Or if I get it off, I can't make it stay. Going back down the street, Scout." I returned and gazed around the curve at the empty road. Occasionally I looked back at Jem, who was patiently trying to place the note on the window-sill. It would flutter to the ground, and Jem would jab it up, until I thought if Boo Radley ever received it, he wouldn't be able to read it. I was looking down the street when the dinner bell rang. Shoulder up, I reeled around to face Boo Radley and his bloody fangs. Instead, I saw Dill ringing the bell with all his might in Atticus's face. Jem looked so awful, I didn't have the heart to tell him "I told you so." He trudged along, dragging the pole behind him on the sidewalk. Atticus said, "Stop ringing that bell." Dill grabbed the clapper. In the silence that followed, I wished he'd start ringing it again. Atticus pushed his hat to the back of his head and put his hands on his hips. "Jem," he said, "what were you doing?" "Nothing, sir." "I don't want any of that. Tell me." We were just trying to give something to Mr. Radley." "What were you trying to give him?" "Just a letter." "Let me see it." Jem held out a filthy piece of paper. Atticus took it and tried to read it. "Why do you want Mr. Radley to come out?" Dill said, "We thought he might enjoy us," and dried up when Atticus looked at him. "Son," he said to Jem, "I'm going to tell you something, and tell you one time. Stop tormenting that man. That goes for the other two of you. What Mr. Radley did was his own business. If he wanted to come out, he would. If he wanted to stay inside his own house, he had the right to stay inside, free from the attentions of inquisitive children, which was a mild term for the likes of us. How would we like it if Atticus barged in on us without knocking, when we were in our rooms at night?